And there we go. Okay. So let me just clear the screen up a little bit so I can see everything. Okay, so we're going to be talking about authentic assessment first, and then specifically some ways in which we can create authentic assessments using some assistance from AI tools. And first, I'd like you to copy the slides, and I will put this in chat. You can either type this in, you can aim a camera at that, and it's going to ask you to make a copy in your drive. I'd encourage you to do it. If you don't like it or if you don't find it useful, you can always delete them later. So just click on that. It'll say, add these to your drive, pick whatever drive account you want to place them in, and then you can follow along because there's some links in here that's going to be useful as we move through this. Okay, so one of the concerns and one of the reasons why, one among many reasons for perhaps encouraging the use of authentic assessment is that we have a bit of a boost in the amount of academic integrity violations that we've seen in the last several years. Just some basic statistics. A couple of years ago, maybe last year, 95% of high school students admitted to cheating during high school. 64% admitted doing it on tests, 58% through some form of copying and pasting without attribution. In 2020, where we saw a really big surge in this during the pandemic, 32% of undergraduates admitted cheating on exams using Chegg and other tools. 2% admitted submitting another student's work as their own. 28% submitted joint work or copied from others when individual work was required. And cheating rates exploded during the pandemic. In particular, pre-COVID, and the study based on a few surveys, 29.9% of students taking online classes admitted to academic integrity violations and online exams. And during COVID, it jumped up to 54.7%. So over half of students admitted to some form of academic integrity issue. And AI has only made this easier. And again, I showed this in some other sessions, but in 2025, 88% of US students in a survey reported using AI. Apparently, I left something out. Reported using AI in their classes for some type of graded assessment. And the percent of students using any AI tool rose from 66% in 2024 to 92% in 2025. And this is as part of their coursework. So we've seen a bit of an explosion in student use of AI. And I just jumped out of the slides one more time. Let me get back there. And so, there's a few things we should keep in mind. And I think most people have recognized this in any case, that pretty much any type of traditional assessment, the things that we used to use regularly in classes, AI can do pretty well. Another thing is there's some surveys out there that indicate that students increasingly believe that what they're doing in the high school classwork and their college classwork is not as relevant as it used to be to their future lives and careers. And a nice summary of much of that research is by Jenny Anderson and Rebecca Winthrop in The Disengaged Teen, helping kids learn better, feel better, and live better. So there's a few things we can do to reduce this. If you're teaching a synchronous class or an in-person class, use only in-class written exams. But, it's not clear that the purpose of our education is to prepare students to be able to take exams in the future. For many people, once they leave college, they're not going to be taking any exams unless going through some sort of certification process or perhaps graduate study. One thing we can do is just try to remind students that they're developing skills that they're going to need later in their education or careers and assessing their development of those skills. And assessing how those skills are developing is important for their progress. And some of these slides are a little rough because I didn't really have a chance to do much with them because I somehow scheduled myself for 5 sessions today, and I had to do a lot of quick work last night. But I think the rest of this is going to be a little cleaner. But again, students don't always feel that what we're asking them to do is that important. And it's not always easy to convince them that these skills are important unless we can directly tie it to something that they value. And one way of doing that is using authentic assessments, which is really the heart of what we're going to be talking about. So, what is an authentic assessment? Well, Grant Wiggins developed the term and he defined it as an assessment that satisfies a few properties. One is it's realistic, that it doesn't seem like something that's contrived, that it's something that seems meaningful to students in and of itself. It requires students to use some judgment and some innovation, some creativity, perhaps. It asks the student to actually do something related to the subject, to do economics or to do human resource related things or to do things in political science or in math that seem meaningful. Um, and also, and this is much of the essence of the authentic part of this, it replicates or simulates the context in which adults are tested in the workplace or in civic or personal life, so that students see that there is some intrinsic value in what they're doing, that this is something that they're going to need to do later, and it's clear that they're developing skills to help them do that. And it somehow assesses a student's ability to efficiently and effectively use the knowledge and skills that they're acquiring to negotiate a complex task. Sometimes these are referred to as wicked problems, a term that's been used in a number of contexts. But it's not something which is direct, it's not something which is just plug some numbers into something and get some results out of it. And it also allows appropriate opportunities to practice, to rehearse, to consult resources, get feedback on, and refine the performances and products. So it's a process where they're growing and developing the skills, and it's easier for students to recognize the progress that they're making. So there's a lot of examples of authentic assessments. One is have students do some type of demonstrate some skills, not necessarily protesting on campus, but demonstrate the skills that they're acquiring. It could be, demonstrate the application of something to a class. It could be some type of a showcase of student work. It could be collaborative group projects that are relevant to the discipline. It could be empirical research, again, in which they're picking a problem often that they choose or that they see as being interesting and engaging. Open pedagogy is a nice form of that, where students are actually creating materials that are publicly shared, which again is intrinsically valuable because they believe that they're creating something that's going to be helpful later. Just a couple of days ago on Facebook, a student commented on a class that I taught back in 2000 where they had developed a wiki. He said it was one of the more meaningful projects that he had done in his college experience. In that class particularly, they were creating a wiki on the history of economic thought, where each student created wiki posts about an individual economy, well, actually created 3 over the course of the semester on either a school of economic thought or the contributions of an individual economist, and that was publicly shared. And I told them this is out there on the web. Other people may find it. And in fact, I'll ask some of my friends who do a lot of work in this area to look at it and give them feedback. And that helped motivate them quite a bit. I've had students create books and podcasts and other things, which again, they found to be a fairly interesting experience because they're creating something that's publicly shared. They know their parents could see it if they want to share it with them. They can share it with potential employers, but they're also demonstrating the skills and the knowledge that they're acquiring in their courses. Realistic role-playing activities where students are put in scenarios where they have to use the skills that they're acquiring to solve problems. There's a lot of those out there, and I'm trying to think of the name of that role-playing package where there's scenarios that have been created. It'll come back to me. Poster sessions where students are presenting their work is a really nice way of doing this, where they might be presenting it just to their classmates, but it could also be something where you invite members of your departments or others to see the work that students have done, and they're spending the whole time period explaining what they've done to others. Having students do interviews, oral histories, community service projects. Another thing related to this is including the NACE competencies in course learning objectives and explicitly tying what you're doing to the competencies so that students can see how what they're doing is developing skills that employers have claimed to be important for student success. Having students write and perform songs, it could be about your discipline. Have students create an ad campaign if they're in marketing. In computer science, have students troubleshoot code that's not functioning properly, although AI does that pretty well as well. Have them write poetry or short stories or collate that or annotate that, etc. There's a lot of things we could do as long as it's something that is relevant to your discipline and where students can see that it is the type of thing that they might envision themselves doing at some point in the future. So here we're going to switch to AI a bit. How we can use AI to create some individualized authentic assessments. One thing you can do, and this has been suggested by a number of people, well, two of the books that we've used in the past for reading groups, Dan Levy's book with Alberta Perez, and also Teaching with Higher Ed by C. Edward Watkins and Watson and Juan. I can't think of his name at the moment either. Okay, I need more sleep. But in any case, use a survey to gather information on student interests and career goals. Download the survey as a spreadsheet, and then replace the student names with a pseudonym or a numeric identifier that you keep so you can match the names in the spreadsheet to the activities, and then ask the AI tool to generate suggestions for authentic learning activities related to a specific learning objective, one or more specific learning objectives in your course that align with the interests of each student. And here's an example. If you'd like, you can fill this out. Just put in a fake name there. I saved this from an earlier workshop with a few names remaining in case no one chooses to do this. But it's basically just asking you to add a name and then put in your hobbies and career objectives and make it up as if you were a student taking a course. And then try it yourself. I can share the spreadsheet that people have done in just a minute. But if you open up ChatGPT or if you open up Gemini, you can take this prompt in, and I'll show it for this example, where I just said students are learning about opportunity costs in an introductory economics class. And then it asks the AI tool to create an authentic assessment activity for each student in which students will learn about, well, in this case, opportunity costs, the same thing as the first line, in a way that is aligned with their hobbies, interests, and/or career goals in the attached spreadsheet. Provide these in a spreadsheet listing sorted by student name. So I'm going to hop out of here for just a second and go over to the spreadsheet. And there's I modified it a little bit, and I'm not sure which one it's connecting to. It's probably this one is the current one. So this is, I think, the form. Well, okay, this is a shorter one where I deleted a few just so that we wouldn't get too many cluttering it up. But we can go back to the earlier one, which is a bit bigger right here, I think. And okay, so let's just take this one. There's a few more responses in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to download this as an Excel spreadsheet. And then I'm going to go to ChatGPT. This works with Gemini too. But the nice thing is ChatGPT will create Excel spreadsheets. Gemini will only create Google Sheets, and then you have to give it permissions to access those, and this is just in some ways easier. So what I'm going to do now is, yes, Steve.
There, I'm just curious, John. I've wanted to ask this question a lot. there are I frequently see suggestions about how you can work with the students like at the beginning of the class to say create a syllabus or to create an assessment, but that kind of seems to not recognize the fact that we like to have everything ready for the course before the course begins. So, in other words, how can I have my students help me create a syllabus, or how can I use student input, like on this session? How can I use student input on what kind of assessments they would like or they would be interested in to create assessments when I want to have all my assessments created before the course begins?
And that is an interesting challenge because, and it's a bit of an inherent contradiction in the UDL approach because, well, with the UDL approach, in theory, we want to create things that work for all students. But if we really want to create an inclusive classroom environment, we may want to try to do things that are appropriate for the specific students that we have in our class. And all classes are different. I used to teach, when I first started here, I would often teach two sections of the same class, often back to back. And the questions, the interests, the directions the questions were going in were often extremely different between the two classes. We always ended up going through the essential concepts by the end of the course, but they'd often be at very different paces depending on the mix of students in the class. And there's a trade-off. We want to have a well-designed class with well-designed and closely aligned assessments that match the learning objectives. But we also might want to customize a little bit to appeal to the individual students. And, you don't have to make everything one or the other. You could reserve some assessments or some things that are a little bit freer, where you can have the basic structure of your course. You could have the major assessments designed in advance. You could have the bulk of your syllabus designed in advance, but you may want to leave some sections of it that can be modified. And, generally our secretaries will be asking for copies of our syllabus right before the semester starts on the first day. What I generally say is, well, I'll have that after the first class meeting or a day after the first class meetings, after we go through this process. Um, so it's a question of how comfortable you are with being a little bit flexible. You can still meet the same objectives, and most of the course can still be fleshed out. The reading can be fleshed out, but you might want to add a little flexibility in some of the assignments. Or if you have presentations as slides, one thing you can always do is upload the slides and say, is there any quick things I can add to this? Some small changes I can make where I'm adding some new active learning activities that align with the interests of the class. And if you have that sort of survey, and the survey is a fairly simple one, right here, it just asks for your name, or in this case, a pseudonym, four things you enjoy doing, and career goals. you know, One of the things that Vijay Sathi and Kelly Hogan recommended, and actually, is doing this survey of interest at the beginning of the class, and Tracy Addy developed that who's in class form that we talked about. I think you were in those reading groups, where you get some information about the students and just make some small connections between the students' interests and our learning objectives, because we want them to learn those skills, but we want them to learn them in a way that they can see the value of. And the essence of the UDL approach is to make sure that students see a connection between what they're being asked to do and their own goals. And that's why it didn't show up in the presentation a couple of days ago, but that's why in the current version of UDL, they put the multiple means of engagement first, because if we can't engage our students, whatever we do beyond there isn't going to matter as much. So we want to connect to as many students as we can. Does that help? You can plan most things, but allowing a little flexibility or some modifications or customizations on the way can work, maybe. Does that seem reasonable, Steve?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so what we have here now is I'm going to take that prompt and and those responses, which oh, they're in downloads now. I'm going to take that prompt and I'm going to put it into ChatGPT and try this too. Oh, and I said I was going to download. Let me give you two versions of it because I'm not sure if everyone actually. Let me go to the downloads, grab those slides. Here is one spreadsheet. And in case anyone filled out the other one, I didn't see any new responses there. No, I'll just give you that one with more responses. Okay. So there's a, did I send that? No, I didn't. There we go. Now you should have, this was filled out from the last time I ran a different session, but well, a few days ago actually. But let's see. So I grabbed that. I'm going to go over to ChatGPT now, and I'm going to paste this prompt in. And that's not the prompt I'm going to paste in. One more time. Okay. I am going to go over to the slides and I am going to, let me try copying it this way. And I am going to paste it into ChatGPT. There we go. And I think let me remove the brackets because I do want them to work in this case, because this is one where it is pretty easy to come up with a pretty diverse mix of opinions or a different diverse view. Well, there's lots of ways in which the concept of opportunity cost can be applied, I think, and we'll see. And then I'm going to attach that spreadsheet, which is in my, I'm going to add photos and files. I'm going to go down to my download folder, and it is, here we go. These are the student responses. I'm going to open that, and I'm going to see what it does. And this is now the inputs. And it's thinking. It takes a little bit more time when it's doing this for multiple people. So it's giving us the pseudonym in this case, which is what I asked. But again, this could be a number, it could be something different, could be a name. And here is the spreadsheet. And by the way, this allows me to modify it. I could do it tied to Bloom's well, the Bloom level of this, the application, analyze, evaluate. I could ask it to generate rubrics. I could ask it to provide low stakes formative assessments, reflection-based activities, or modify it to align with tilt. But we'll just go with this, and I'm just going to download that, and let's see what it does. And it opened up on my other screen. Let me bring it over. Once I get some of the other things out of the way, there we go. Come on, me. Okay, so now I should be able to bring it over, and it is hiding under the screen, I'm hoping. Well, in any case, it should be in here. There we go. It was halfway between the two screens. Let me make this bigger. Um, well, let me expand this row. And it's always easier to do this when you're not presenting. What I want to do is to do the wrap task text in the right column. One more time, wrap text. And I guess, okay, there we go. Wrap text. That was my fault here. And I'm going to make this column a lot bigger and make the font a lot bigger. Okay, so here, well, that's still not a lot bigger. Let me bring it up to something a little closer to accessibility standards. There we go. So this aligns with the student interest. So you'd have to look at the spreadsheet originally, but for the first person and the name, let me make those bigger too, at least. So here that was, I think I did 24. Let me bring that up to there. So these were the pseudonyms or the numbers or whatever you had for each student. And here it's asking them to, it's taking their interests, and it's, this was someone who wasn't sure of their goal, but it's asking them to identify a typical choice they make, and ask them what sort of next best alternative they gave up, which is the definition of opportunity cost. That may not be the best answer. You can always modify these. These aren't very good this time. Usually it does something better with something like this. Okay, well, sometimes it doesn't work so well. And then you may want to go back and ask it to revise this a little bit. Um, Well, one thing you could do is you could. So Steve asked, how can the professor be sure that the assessments generated will be equally difficult or challenging? One thing you can do is you could use Bloom's taxonomy and you could say, please, create assessments that are realistic. What I probably should have added to this prompt that these are realistic activities that students could see themselves engaging in, and they should all be at whatever Bloom's level is appropriate for the assignment and the course. And when you add more detail into the prompt, that will make them better align with what you were hoping for. And none of these are really very good. It's basically kind of plugging in those things into the definition. So these are all very low level activities. When I last tried this, yesterday, it did it much better. But that happens with AI sometimes. But again, if you don't like the results, you can modify it a little bit and come up with something which is more closely aligned with what you want them to do. And probably if I go back and redo this, let me get out of there. We can say redo this, providing more realistic scenarios, let's say at a higher level of Bloom's taxonomy. And then it will generate a new set. Because if it doesn't work, you didn't waste a lot of time doing it, and you can still, come up with some other alternatives, um, and see if this does anything better. Well, in any case, it's going to do this and it's going to generate a spreadsheet. But so here, more realistic near-term decision context and so forth. So it's going to make it more realistic. Now, here it's doing it within the next 6 to 12 months. You may want to extend that out to, post-college applications to again create a more realistic scenario, um, and so on. And let's just say display these. And that way we won't have to download and make the fonts bigger. Maybe. And again, this is kind of a plug in the box type of thing. So this is not doing very well. When I last did it, it tied things much more closer to these things. And sometimes that happens with AI. And you can just keep working on it. But I don't want to spend too much time on this. But this is one way you can try to do this. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But the higher the quality of the prompt, the more detail you put into the prompt, the more successful it will be. And I was really hoping it would do things tied more closely to the career goals. So let's move past this one and look at some other examples. One thing you can do is is create this. And here, if you've downloaded this, you can click on it. This is a GPT I created actually yesterday as a chatbot I created both in ChatGPT and in Gemini. And there's instructions here that were generated by ChatGPT telling you what to do. But basically, if you just click on this, it's going to open up ChatGPT. Oh, that's the guide. This tells you what the purpose is, how it works, some of the benefits and use cases. And if we go over to the actual GPT, if we go to the actual GPT and the link doesn't work, I will fix that now. So I am going to go over here to the GPT, and the GPT was called, well, let's go down here, Explore GPTs, and then in the GPTs, I'm going to look at my GPTs, and I'll share a link to that now. The Authentic Assessment Designer. I will fix the link in there. So one more time, I'm going to now share this, and I'm going to copy the link and drop it into chat. And if you can, just try this and let me know how it works. This is not designed to create something specific to individual students, but it gives you suggestions. In particular, if you type in if you describe the assignment or the learning objective that you'd like to reach, provide it with some discussion of your class, basically the title of your class maybe, and the level of your students, some interests of your students, and so forth. And then it will give you some suggestions, or a dozen of them, for authentic assessments, as well as rubrics that you can use to evaluate the work. It suggests four suggestions here. Let's say here, design authentic assessments for an undergraduate something. Let's see what it is. In an undergraduate biology class, for example. And it's going to now ask a few questions. Well, or not. It's grounding it in commonly accessible ones. The more detail you put in, the better it will give you. And here's some examples. Biology in the news. It gives you, again, a rubrics for them, and so forth. And it asks you if you want to modify any of those. Or let's say, well, since it failed pretty badly, given my crappy prompt, let's say create an authentic assessment in which, or create authentic assessment, yeah, authentic assessments in which students, and I didn't put that in the, okay, in which students, let's say, explore the concept one more time of opportunity costs in an introductory microeconomics course. And again, I could put in more detail, but this is something which is misspelled. One more time. There we go. And here it's going to do something with this. Well, that's not so bad. And you notice in each case, I had it put the duration of the project in. Some of them could be done in a class period or a few minutes. Some could be done more, over a shorter time. And it's telling you roughly where in a 15-week, 14 to 15-week semester, the assignment might be appropriate. And you can get more details on any of those. So, you could then ask it, provide more details or instructions for choice 8 or whatever. And, it's doing something like this allows you to automate some of these things so it doesn't take a lot of time to introduce them. You can have pretty much all the steps of the assessment generated by ChatGPT, or you could tweak it however you like. You could always copy this into, Brightspace and modify it to meet your specifications and so on. So, yeah, so that's basically, you know, has how many people have worked? Does anyone have any examples of good authentic assessments that you've used in the past?
I've had students conduct a statistics uh, hypothesis test project where they need to conduct a hypothesis test on a topic of their choice
Mhm.
by conducting a survey to collect data between one or more populations and then try to conduct whether or not, and then create a null and alternative hypothesis around that particular population and their parameters, and then assess whether the data they've collected can reject that status quo null hypothesis and support the alternative instead. And they have to discuss how they collected the data, what they did to test the data, and why this data is or is not sufficient evidence to support this alternative hypothesis instead.
Mhm. I do something very similar. It's in my econometrics class where students work on a semester-long project with multiple steps where they're conducting hypothesis tests and so forth, um, and building a model and testing the model, testing the assumptions of the model, and so forth. But when they get to choose the project they're working on, that builds in, a bit more of an authentic nature to it. Steve had asked a question about planning things in advance. When I first introduced an open pedagogy, the option of an open pedagogy project in the economics capstone, I was a little bit nervous about it because I was used to coming in there with a list of readings for the semester, a list of topics, going back quite a ways. To be fair, I should note I did it gradually. I had students for many years work on a semester-long research project from the beginning to the end of the semester, but I originally selected readings on a wide mix of topics in which they're applying mathematical economic concepts every week on a different topic. I had students do the presentations on those, but then I let them choose those topics on the first day of class. So first, I let them choose the weekly readings that they'd be presenting. I'm sorry, the topics. I still choose the readings. I, find working paper and journal articles. Um, but then I introduced, after listening to a presentation by Robin DeRosa a number of years ago on open pedagogy, I gave them the option of doing an open pedagogy project. And I described some things they could do working in small groups. And the first year, they chose to write a book. It was basically a project which we developed as the course progressed. The first day, we came up with a general syllabus, an outline of the project, the steps, and so forth, and so on. But it was something that was very much built on the fly with not a lot of prior structure. Well, the general structure was built in on the first day of class, and this is a 3-hour class. It meets once a week. So a good chunk of the first day was just saying, okay, what's the topic? How are we going to sort this into groups? How are we going to have these groups function efficiently? How are we going to do the peer review process to help polish this project? And where is it going to be published? How is it going to be published? How are we going to assess the progress that you're making on it? And it was giving up a lot of control. Now, of course, I had a say in all those things. I was part of all those discussions, but it is a little scary when you first do that because you don't quite know how it's going to work. But it turned out to work really well, and I had so much more student engagement when they were picking the topic. Over the years, they've worked. Oh yeah, no, it doesn't require a paid version, Steve. You just need to use a free ChatGPT account can use this. It's just a GPT. No, they'll always offer to take your money, but just sign in as a free account on ChatGPT, and it should work. But you do have to be signed in. You can't use it unless you log in, but you can always log in. Well, and I should note there is a Gemini version, and I hope the Gemini version is correct. It doesn't prompt quite as much, but if we go back to that slide, yeah, let me go back to that slide. There is a gem version which works with our chat with our Gemini account, and it's basically the same prompt. But oh, I had it design some mathematical economic assessments when I tried it before. But basically, it will generate assessment ideas with sequencing rubric levels and the type tags, which is again the same type of thing that was used. So either one of those, and well, and I will correct that. If you go into the slides and click on the link for the slides, you can download a new copy. Right after the session, I will have the correct link in there. But it can work really well. In that class, they've jointly created books on intergenerational income and wealth inequality, the causes of that. They created books on the economics of education. They've done books on when they couldn't all agree on a general theme, but they had a lot of topics they wanted to work on that they were really committed to in groups as we worked through the process. It was current economic crises because that was the only thing they had in common, that they involved some type of a crisis. Um, and in other semesters, like last year, they decided to create a series of podcasts where each group of students produced a couple of podcasts over the course of the semester, as well as all the other work that was already built into the class, where they were reading articles, commenting on them, posting on them, presenting them, and so forth. And it was pretty easy for them to see the connections between what they were doing and their future life. And way back, the first time I did it, we did a podcast with some of the students in the class where they talked about how much they enjoyed and valued the fact that they had created something that they could link to in their LinkedIn profiles, that they could share with the parents to explain that, all the money they had helped pay for their colleges is actually paying off, so that they've learned something that they can then publicly display. And they really took a lot of pride in the work that they had out there. So I've really enjoyed the outcome. Again, it was a little scary at first, and I still have no idea exactly what sort of projects or what are the topics they're going to be working with. And many of the topics they choose are ones that were not part of my expertise in the same way. So I've been learning along with them. And that's also been kind of interesting because they often will want to do some type of work on topics where I just haven't done as much reading. And I go out and find those articles for them, read through them myself. So I'm ready to help work with them, as they develop their presentations and as they discuss them in class and using hypothesis with social annotation. And it's been an enjoyable experience, but it is a little scary. And, I know I felt a lot safer when I went into a class knowing exactly what we'd be doing at every week, at every class, but it can be a little freeing too to leave it open. But yes, anyone can use these tools. They're actually both public. So, and if you don't like it, you can always modify it. And if you don't like the output, just ask some additional questions and it will revise it. Okay, so any other examples of authentic assessments? Community service projects are a good one. The vote as we
John,
go
are
projects
you
are great.
you're asking for things that we do?
Yes. Mhm.
Well, one thing that I do, I was mentioning this before, is um, in my labor relations course, one, I actually have them negotiate a collective bargaining agreement. It's not an exercise that I created. It was an exercise that was created by a colleague at University of Minnesota. It's fantastic. It has a collective bargaining agreement that's about to expire and gives them all kinds of information on, the whole, it's about a hotel, and it gives them the hotel, and it tells them the economic conditions, the number of employees, there's actually internal websites for the employees' preferences that they need to go to and look at. I mean, it's really a fantastic exercise. And another thing that I do in that course is I've created arbitration scenarios with actual sections of a collective bargaining agreement, one team has to act as the employer, one team has to act as the union representative representing the aggrievement, and one team acts as the arbitration team, and they actually have to prepare the arbitration for the arbitration hearing and then conduct the hearing. I think
That's a
those,
great
especially the second one, is pretty. I mean, a lot of these students are not going to be negotiating collective bargaining agreements, at least right out of college, but a lot of them may have to act as the role of, in grievance hearings.
that would be that's a great example. Those are great examples of that. Um, and I couldn't think of the name before. And in terms of some role-playing scenarios, which are fairly structured, but are in many disciplines, and that's the Reacting to the Past series that came out of Barnard College. And that's a continually growing series. Some are semester-long activities, some are one day. And the ones you're doing, Steve, the things you're doing there are great, where you put students in roles that they could see themselves participating in which they're taking what they've learned and they're applying it in a realistic scenario. So role-playing activities are great. And here, there's like some great ones here. We had someone in the um, I forgot what department he was in, but he actually took a group of faculty through one of these a while back. It must have been in Earth, well, geological sciences, whatever, atmospheric and geological sciences, whatever the current name is, where they were working through, or they played the role of the people deciding whether Pluto was a planet, was one example of that, where it took people through that scenario and one other scenario. And it was kind of interesting to see how that developed because it was done weekly for a few weeks just to show how these role-playing scenarios could be adopted. But again, a lot of this can be generated by interacting with AI tools fairly effectively. Any others? Well, and in my econometrics class, one other example, I did switch from having student presentations in the last week or so of the class where they presented their project. But what would happen is one person, or sometimes they worked in pairs, would be up presenting while everyone else was just sitting there thinking, I've got to do this myself. And there really wasn't that much interaction. And most of the time, people were sitting there watching other people while they were worried about their own. And then I switched from that to a poster session where they created posters, not very impressive posters, not printed. I just had them basically print things up and tape them to a poster board that I gave them. But they'd spent the whole class period explaining the work to other people as they came around. And I broke it up so that, half of the class would be presenting at one point and the other half would be asking questions. And then I'd have of the people presenting, half of them would go and get to talk to the people in the other half and then switch it and then, do the same process the next class period. And, it took a lot of pressure off. It was somewhat lower stakes, so it was less anxiety. But instead of just spending 10 minutes or so presenting on their semester long project, they got to spend nearly the whole class period explaining it to other people and responding in real time to those questions. And I found it much more interesting, and students did too. And it was much more engaging than just sitting there waiting for your chance and then being really nervous and uncomfortable during that whole process. And the presentation, I think they had to be able to respond in real time, where even when they were presenting, there was just a limited amount of time for questions because, up until COVID, there were generally 30 or 40 students in that class, and it took a long time to go through that whole set of presentations. And here it was a little bit more efficient. And also members of the department came and sat in. And a couple of times we had an earlier dean come in and observe them and interact, partly because her husband was in class one of those years, and that worked nicely too. But students were impressed by that, and they really appreciated that other members of the department came in and looked at their work and complimented them and asked some questions, and that they were able to respond. So, any other examples of authentic assessment? Well, that's pretty much all I have for this. Try that tool and, forget that crappy prompt that I put in there. It used to work much better than this, but it gave scenarios where people were working in various careers and had to make choices. But you can revise it to turn it into something much more meaningful and much more relevant, simply by asking them to take things related to their careers or hobbies as the basis for the this the assignment you're asking it to give them. Um, and apparently that one, I did not test that one yesterday, but it was just doing a very simple sort of, it created a basic template and just modified it by a trivial amount, which wasn't really very helpful. Okay, any questions or comments or thoughts?
Thank you, John.
Okay, well, thank you and see you
Thank
later.
you.
Thank you.